First of all, I'm Carlin Moulton, and I want to wish you all a very happy new year. This is the first time we get to see most of your familiar faces, and so I hope it is the first of many times we get together. I want to thank you all for coming out on this very frosty January day. It is our pleasure to host this event honoring the work of our dear friend, neighbor, Ian Carr-Harris, and on the occasion of the launch of his book. A few things I would like to say just before we get going. Ian is undoubtedly one of the most astute commentators and participants in the Toronto art scene over the last 50 years. And I have to say that this is a document, which I was up reading till midnight last night, Ian, that intersects with my own history to some extent. And so at the same time as there are many commentaries about many different things, I'm also learning things about people who I consider to be my friends. Nancy Johnson, Joanna Householder, and I'm wearing my Women's Cultural Building Collective button as we get an honorable mention in the text. And it was a group which changed my life, I have to say. And so there are many trajectory shifting moments that are documented in this book. But much more importantly, I think Ian is illustrating and explicating what else was going on at the time. And what I was compelled by was this idea of the retracing, the palimpsest, an idea which has been returned to often in art. And in fact, there's a sculpture over there by Dale Dunning of the same name, where you're taking different layers of text and taking them away and adding back to them and reinterpreting the text in a different way. And so it seemed to me that this book is at the same time a personal diary and yet an exceptional cultural archaeologist's record. And by reading it, language we begin to understand is an ear, not just a voice. It's how we're accessing the traces of the previously unconscious, our ideas perhaps not yet fully formed. And I would say that this is true of both visual and written languages, and how we arrive at perhaps what I meant to say was. And it is that process that Ian writes about. And he says that most of us succumb to a romantic fantasy, vainly hoping to become a part of history. And I would say, with this volume, you guarantee your place in it. Before I introduce our host for this event, I want to acknowledge an irony that today's speakers are too aware of, but equally too polite to mention. And that is the absurdity of hosting this event within a venue where we blatantly attempt to construct an economically viable and sustainable enterprise out of pursuits that are inherently at their core a rejection of the commercial exchange. We live within that tension as fortuitously it keeps the lights on. And so therefore, let me say, we do have a limited number of Ian's books available for sale here this afternoon, should you wish to acquire one at the conclusion of this event. It is now my pleasure to turn this event over to Deborah Root, our host. Deborah is another one of our, I would say, local and distinguished public intellectuals and a cultural critic and writer who focuses on the intersection of visual art and cultural politics. She has been a professor. She's the author of many essays, and including the seminal work, if you haven't read it, Art Appropriation and Commodification of Difference. It is my hope that our collaboration with Deborah will continue over the coming months, and that this will be the first in a series of talks where we might, in fact, think about art. So thank you very much for organizing this, Deborah. Thank you, Ian.
So, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our speakers today. I'll introduce all three now, with Ian's talk following the first two speakers. And then we can open the floor to questions after they're finished. So, we are definitely here to celebrate Ian Carr-Harris's collections of writings, Tracing Writing Art 1975-2020. Think of that. 45 years of engagement in the intellectual, aesthetic, and political issues of a particular place. As such, Ian's book operates as a time machine, transporting us to the unique and dynamic art world of Canada and Toronto, and to the ideas and work that animated this period of time. Tracing is a hugely important archive of an intellectual, artistic, and experimental world, one that shifted as the practices of artists changed and adapted. Today, in Toronto at least, that world is almost unrecognizable, a result of gentrification and other factors. The ideas that animated this art world remain relevant, however, as do the broad range of concerns apparent in Ian's writing. In an approach to criticism, an article from 1975 that was originally published in Parachute magazine, Ian writes of his I Am the Queen of England, quote, "The work has become static theater, occupying a position between art object and public performance in order to see more closely what seeing gives," end of quote. For me, this statement set up a chain reaction of thoughts, intersecting with my preoccupation with narrative. And because Ian's writings reverberate in a multiplicity of ways, someone else will find another set of ideas that resonates, as did Karen Valahora, who recently wrote in the Gazette that she was struck in this book by, quote, "the assertion within a collection of writings that the spoken word is richer in nuance and direction than the written, and further that artworks are conversation," end of book. As such, Tracings offers a deep understanding of both time, that is, the intellectual and artistic history of the last several decades, and of space, in that the breadth of the ideas that Ian delineates maps out and reveals how intellectual and artistic practices intersect and enrich each other. Ian has had a long and fruitful practice as a visual artist. He represented Canada at the Sydney and Venice Biennales and at Documenta 8. He's shown and published widely here and internationally and received the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. He is also a member of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. His work is held in many public and private collections, and his most recent show is currently up at the Susan Knotts Gallery in Toronto. Our first speaker will be Robert Wiens, whose work engages deeply with the natural world and evinces a strong environmental corpus. His images of trees, and more recently mushrooms, are striking for their detail and precision, and for his insistence that we humans, recognize our connection to nature and to the rhizomatic ecosystem and its intensely connected organisms. Robert's focus on the forest and his witnessing of the pressures on the natural world reminds me of the figure of the Green Man, that ancient protector of the woods. Indeed, besides being an important Canadian artist, Robert has acted in the community here, and his yearly sale of native saplings makes it possible for us to rehabilitate and restore our own landscapes. Robert's work has been shown at the National Gallery, the AGO, the Carroll Plant, and elsewhere, internationally and in Canada. It exists in a number of public and private collections. He is also a founding member of the Mercy Union Arts Center. Robert's recent solo exhibition, Hyphen Hi-Fi, showed Hull Petro Contemporary Art in Toronto in 2023. Our second speaker is Paulette Phillips. Over her long and productive career, she has worked in film, theater, sculpture, and film installation. Paulette is interested in, among many other things, the instability of truth and meaning, and the extent to which notions of human nature subtend our understanding of natural phenomena. This is apparent in her important piece, Her Directed Lie, for which she was trained as a polygraph technician. Here, Paulette uses a lie detector test to interrogate the nature of truth and falsehood. The results, which are not about truth per se, but rather about the body's response to stress, reveal the slippage between the inquisitor's agenda and the outcomes of such questioning. This instability is also apparent in A Floating House, a film loop in which a house floats in water, provoking a feeling of dislocation, of things being where they're not supposed to be. Again, there is slippage between the viewer's expectation and perception of the real and the enduring precariousness of the natural world, here perhaps because of the effect of climate change. Paulette's work has been widely shown in Canada and internationally, including on Carroll Plant and the Tate Modern. It appears in several collections, such as the National Gallery, the MoMA in New York, and elsewhere. Paulette currently shows at DS Contemporary at Toronto and Daniel Harnell Contemporary Art in London, England. So I think we'll have Robert, Paulette, and then Ian. So Robert?
Yeah. Thanks, Sharon. I was going to, I guess, talk about 1973 when I first saw Ian's work, and maybe give some context to the Toronto scene at the time. And I don't know, I thought about it. I've kind of changed my mind. But I was going to talk about, getting a warehouse space, quitting art school. Warehouse spaces were cheap. All my friends had warehouse spaces. And then art galleries started moving into that area. They kind of moved away from the boutique-y scene at Dorkville into much more open spaces. So things started to change. I think, writing was a real important part of that change as well. There were all these, there were a number of just newspapers or broadsheets that formed, magazines. Artists were writing about each other's work, like in Artist Review. There were all kinds of opportunities for artists to actually express in writing what they saw out there. Funding was also another big aspect of this. There was funding from 3 levels of government, and it was often quite generous, and new spaces started, like right in 1980 anyway. YYZ, Mercer Union. There already was a space, and the music gallery. All these places were just forming, and there was a very lively scene. I thought maybe I shouldn't talk about all that. Because really, this would be like listening to someone in 1973 talk about someone from 1920, the art scene in Toronto in 1920. I don't know, was sort of like checkers and cigars at the Arts and Letters Club or something. But I think 1973 actually was an important year, because for me, it was the very first time I saw Ian's work. It was at the Oeno Gallery. I'd say I was confounded and bewildered. It was a very difficult show to process for me. I think I was trying to sort of see where did it fit in? Where did this work, which seemed so unusual, fit in? It wasn't really sculpture as I had known it. It didn't involve acetylene torches or enamel paint. It was very different. It wasn't minimalism. It wasn't conceptualism, or at least I couldn't quite pinpoint it that way. It didn't seem to fit any ism. And well, just as an example, I'm trying to remember some of the works in that show, but a lot of them were on tables that had very long legs, I remember, and were kind of high. They were, they had objects fastened to them, And there were a lot of photographs on the walls with letter-set text. The text was related to the photograph, but not in the way that, say, the text on a newspaper photograph would relate. It kind of led you away from the photograph, and it kind of circled around, kind of came back. It wasn't exactly descriptive. I think one of the pieces I'm trying to recall was a more object-based work, which was a piece that referenced, well, the text of the piece was Julius Caesar's thigh as he crossed the Rubicon. And this work, I did a bit of research into it this morning. I looked into crossing the Rubicon, and what that is Julius Caesar was a governor of the northern provinces. This is my English now, in Southern World, but it's because I have to remember Latin, or I'm not very good at that. It's when he crossed the Rubicon, he crossed into a territory that, well, it was kind of a demilitarized zone in a sense. Rome forbid any weapons to come past the Rubicon. The Rubicon was then a kind of border that couldn't be crossed with weapons. But crossing it, Julius Caesar was declaring war on Rome. Basically, kind of a treasonous act. Anyway, he is reported to have said, "Iacta alea est," and that is, the die is cast. But in Ian's work, the thigh is cast. It took me over 50 years to do that. But I'm getting there. And I'll keep you posted on any other further developments. Anyway, I think Ian's been an incredible mentor to me and to many people. He's been an inspiration as well. And I think he's been a great teacher. He's a great teacher. I sat in on his classes and he listens. And I think that's a mark of a good teacher. I would say I'm really looking forward to looking at this book. And I'm looking forward to being confounded all over again. Thanks.
It's a great book. And I love digging into it. And I appreciate the things that Robert said. It's hard not to feel that we should talk about the good old days.
Yeah.
And Ian represents so much of that. And you kind of inspire me to think about the artist culture that I sort of inherited, but came into like later than, I'm not in the 70s, I'm one of the 80s. But it was established to me, and this book is such a walk down memory lane. It's just such a rich read, and I'm reminded of so much about those things. Anyway, I had the pleasure of teaching with Ian, from beside Ian or in the environment that Ian was influencing for so many years. at OCAD, and I've recently retired, and Ian, I think, retired maybe 5 years ago, but I was, just to be in a classroom with Ian was so fabulous, and I learned so much from being with him. But he also, he established, along with his colleagues, the sculpture installation program. And think about, I was writing with Mike Buchanan, who was Ian's student, and he talked, what was the name of the course again?
I think necessary conditions for making
Necessary
art.
conditions for making art. Just how clear and fabulous is that? That is Ian in a nutshell, the necessary conditions for making art. The empowerment of students too. Ian was not, he was someone who, I think how would we say this, his reputation was intimidating because he is because his combative language is just so astute and concise and particular and dead on. What can I say? He's a brilliant orator and a brilliant speaker, and he has a mind like a steel trap. And so, the art, the business of making art is full of feeling and mushy ideas, and so, to meet someone with the clarity of Ian can be intimidating, but he was so generous in giving to students, and they learned so much, and they found their voice. And he gave the way a class worked with Ian when we co-taught in thesis was that it was student-led. It was 100% student-led, and so we were the last ones to speak, and I think often Ian was the very last person to speak. So it's not like, it sounds like he was creating, a kind of top-down pedagogy. In fact, it was very student-led, and it was so generous and respectful. It was, what are we looking at? What is it? How does it speak to us? And those were the conditions by which we approached the artwork. It was all about the artwork and all about whatever the artist brought into that room, and they had to, they didn't have to defend it. In fact, the artist didn't speak, the work spoke. And the people around the students found their way to observe and to comment on what it was they were seeing and what that made them feel. So the articulation was kind of really basic and beautiful. It was a great part. It was great to be a part of that. And the ideas and the things we talked about went so far and so deep. And it was a brilliant education for all of us. And I'm sure Ian felt like he was learning as well. We always did. We always felt like we were 100% in a learning environment. I have a really discursive notes. And a lot of it, and it's wonderful that Robert talked about the good old days. And one of the things that came up as I was researching this, Claire Greenlaw, who wrote the essay at Ian has a show at Susan Hopps right now. Susan Hopps Gallery in Toronto. It's a beautiful show. I popped in and saw it. It's a compendium of works that are revived, and older works and new, but I don't think there's any new works in it. Are there? Maybe Trace.
Yeah, it's Trace.
Is Trace a new word?
Yeah, I guess it is.
Yeah, you wouldn't think. It's the kind of foundation of what he has been doing, maybe for the last 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah, 10, 12, 15.
I think about, I'm gonna jump all over the place because, I think about Claire Greenlaw because she's a young artist, a very interesting artist, very good artist, and she wrote the essay that supported Ian's show. Susan always asks an artist to write about the artwork on display and on exhibition, and Claire put her writing in the present and two futures, which I found really interesting because if we're talking about, you could think of Ian as being an artist who deals with nostalgia, because I think that's his trick and trade. Look at this thing that traces of our histories that appear in the work and make us think and create meaning in the work and a relationship to the work. It's always the memory that you evoke. Because we've lived, because of the material world that we live in and the ideas that are kind of contained in the artwork. So I just thought about a young artist putting the work in the register of the future, because this present is very unknown right now, and I think we're all feeling a kind of a strange relationship to the present, because we still have this aftermath of the digital and its relationship to the material world that artists live in, and it's just really complicated right now. It's
It
really
sure is.
complicated as we move into a new era, and I really feel like we are moving into a new era, but we're not there yet. So we feel, I think I speak for people, we feel this enormous schism with where we are at the moment. And I think young people feel it too, because there's this idea of an inheritance, but it's not working anymore. Even the art world is very unstable. Caroline mentioned that. The artwork is very unstable at the moment, and the relationship of artists to the world we live in is it's very scary for artists, a very scary time. So I just want to acknowledge that this is a history and a looking back to an era that we thrived in, where we were building culture, and culture was meaningful and important. I'm not getting emotional or anything. But there are a couple of things that are really important to me about Ian. He loved women. I'm just going to say that. I feel the deep respect that Ian has for human artists and for female sensibility. And I just want to identify that I've always loved that about Ian. I love conversation with him. He's very generous. He creates community. That's the other thing that is huge. Like, here we are. He's creating community here, and it's immensely important. And he brings people from all over, really, the world, and he'll make, he and Yvonne are real community makers, and they're very generous people. I could go on. I could talk about his work. I'm not at his, Deborah speaks so beautifully and I could, anyway. He's important to, he creates hope. The book creates hope. The book reminds us of why we're here, reminds us of why we do what we do. So for that, it's very, very important. But you open it up and you start reading Dan Adler's introduction. And I'm struck when he talks about debate and difference. And that's such an important part of Ian's practice. And debate is so problematic right now. We can't say what we feel, we can't say what we need, because we're going to be shut down or we're going to be attacked. So this idea of debate has vanished from our artistic milieu, because we're afraid of each other and we're afraid to speak our minds. So I'm reminded of how important that is, and how bold Ian is in his opinions and his... And it's hilarious to revisit the art world and to think about these people that we're part of a huge community, and it's just, okay, so I'm going to move all day to listen to this, but the idea of being Canadian, hugely important for Ian, and I took that as an enormous gift to the Canadian art world, because as, Ian, in the position that he is in life, existed when Canada was a colony, and the idea of Canada being a colony was really, I think, fundamental to, a kind of backwater idea of what Canada was and what it meant to be a Canadian artist. I always remember Ian saying, you don't go to New York, you don't go to London, you don't go to these centers for making a scene. The scene is here. And so the idea of being Canadian and the idea of investing into Canadian history and a Canadian community, we have that to thank Ian for, among other people, but Ian did that so very well. The verb to do, tracing. There's so many, we think of our art in so many different ways. I think of mimicry because I work in performance, and other people, and I think of translation, because there's a translation that goes on when we make art. The for Ian, it's tracing, and that's not a surprise. And there's something beautiful about what tracing means, and the intimacy of that. I mean, I think intimacy is a big part of Ian's stock and trade. The other things that made me think today were mise en scene. And I think what Robert was talking about the artwork in 1973, but me coming from theater and film, I would think that was a mise en scene that we saw, and that we were given a stage, that we walked into it, and players in the stage that created meaning. out of the elements that we're presented with. And the idea of meaning making is just so fundamental to Ian's practice, to my practice, to Robert's prayer, all of our. The idea is that we're meaning making. And I just want to come back to this idea of mise en scene, is that it's very, it requires the viewer to enter into a scene and to make sense and be an active player within that scene, so that you are both actor and spectator at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I think Ian's been hugely influential in my own practice, and those are, maybe I want to leave it at that, because I think we've listened to us enough, and we want to listen to Ian. But yeah, I'm just going to leave this. I guess I want to say something personal, and that is one time when I went into Ian's studio. He always has students coming to his place on Ossington. He was on Ossington Avenue. It was a center, he always had 2 parties a year. Students look forward to coming together and talking. One Christmas levee I went to, there's the main floor, which was all about bringing people together. And in the basement, I was just so shocked to see your studio, Ian. It was so humble, this studio in the basement where he made all this brilliant work, and yet the makeup, it was no bigger than this little area, I don't think. And there was a chop saw and a few humble tools, and it struck me. I don't know, it struck me. It was poetic, might I just say. There's a poetry to the way that your studio. It's humbleness, and yet it created such great art. Those are things that I want to add to this. Thank you, and I look forward to reading all of this book, and I look forward to hearing what he has to share.
Well, I think I'm going to have to say I'm humbled. And if this afternoon had to close right now, I'd be quite happy. Not because of the statements about myself, but about these incredibly interesting remarks about how art practice functions, the context in which it does function, has functioned, and the delight in hearing 2 very honored colleagues talk about the same times and the same life that I experienced myself in a very specific place, Toronto in the 1970s through the 1990s and into the 2010s. So I'd have to say that I was glued to my chair listening to these remarks and how important they are for me to hear and to hear from 2 fellow artists whose work I have always admired and whose practices I always look forward to seeing. So I'm hoping that you can hear me. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, I'll bit louder. Maybe I'm hiding my microphone too hard. Is that better? A little bit higher. Okay. I'm well known for mumbling, so I'll try not to. What I really want to do here, though, is to focus on the book. I'm not going to focus on my own career, and I'm delighted that Rob and Paulette have given you a sense of that, because that is important. But really, it's the book that I'm anxious to forward this evening. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the book. I want to talk about the process by which the book has come into place. It surprised me the other day to realize, when I dug up some old emails, that I originally got an invitation from Jeffrey Little at Concordia University Press wondering if I would be interested in participating in a series of publications that they were embarking upon. And I was struck by the fact, and I hadn't realized this, but that email was in 2018, exactly 6 years, almost to the day from where we are right now. So you may be interested to know that it can take 6 years for a book to come to fruition. It's not something that happens overnight. Those 6 years were occupied to a great extent by discussions around what should be in the book, examinations of whether in fact they were available in any useful fashion, discussions about what would come together as a book instead of, you might say, passages that seemed beside the point. So, one writes sometimes beside the point. So it was an incredible journey to work with Geoffrey Little and his successor, Ryan Van Hoste, at Concordia University Press to bring this to where we are now. And I'd just like to read this because I think it meshes with what Rob and Paulette have mentioned. But this is from Geoffrey Little at the press. And within the email, there was a particular paragraph that I thought would be interesting to read. And he writes, writings by artists transmit a way of thinking about artistic practice that the writings of academics do not. Artists' texts bridge gaps between critical or curatorial writing and artistic practice, and they have the potential to generate new creative opportunities. As well, by bringing together materials previously published in ephemeral media such as lectures, online, and print interviews, and small-run or limited distribution publications, formats that are often inaccessible only to geographically limited or specialized publics, a collection such as this would make your texts available to a wide audience. I believe such a project would appeal to a broad readership of Canadian and international art historians, practicing artists, curators, cultural studies, scholars, and students. I was thrilled to hear that because, as Paulette especially has pointed out, things slip into history. And at a certain point, the point, for instance, that I'm at right now, you start to think, well, am I just history? Is that the end? Is this just a document that's going to sit on a shelf someplace and gather dust? And when Geoffrey Little says that he thinks that it's important for these various publications that existed ephemerally to come together and constitute a record, but a record that is there as a living document that others now, without that history, can read through and understand things that are in fact far from simply historic. They are in fact pan-historic. They exist for us even today. Perhaps the words are different, but in any case, the thoughts and the challenges remain the same. So that was one of the reasons why when Geoffrey asked me to participate, I thought, well, yes, I think this would be a grand thing for the press to concentrate on. And in fact, it is a concentration. The Concordia University Press saw this series of books devoted to the writings by Canadian artists as one of their premier projects. And I wanted just to bring two in that series to mind here, so that you understand that I'm not alone in this, that the writings of Ken Lum and the writings of Liz McGore are equally in that same series. And it's so important to understand that we're all in it together, that this is an enterprise that all of us are participating in and hoping and imagining that these writings have a life that goes far beyond the history that we have experienced ourselves. Anyway, I wanted to make that point. I'm going to also say that that on the question of recognizing that one isn't alone in the world, and of course we've just heard my friends Rob and Paulette amplify that point. I want to just give my acknowledgments to, I've given my acknowledgement to Jeffrey Little and the press. Jeffrey Little was originally the director of the press, but he then was asked to become the chief librarian at Western Ontario, University of Western Ontario, which is where he is now. And his position was taken over by Ryan Van Housty and Ceylan Tourdy. So I've worked over the last 4 years, let's say, with Ryan and Ceylan in Montreal to bring this thing through. Any case, so I want to acknowledge the incredible amount of work that they have taken on in producing this book. And it's always been a kind of back and forth, a sort of process of working things through and challenging this or challenging that. And of course, this is an academic publication, even though not by an academic. And academic publications have to go through peer review. So there is an incredible amount of specificity, incredible amount of fact-checking that goes into the process. You can't get away with sloppy publication. So Ryan and Ceylan did an amazing job at ensuring that all along the line, if the writing seemed, if it wasn't quite clear where the writing came from or who might have been involved in it, they made sure that I discovered who was involved in it and was able to make sure that information got forwarded. One of the big things that also, if you're ever going to go to press, is a press of this nature at any rate, is getting or securing permissions. Permissions, I think, must have occupied at least 3/4 of my time over the last little while, because it's one thing to have an image, it's one thing to have a text, it's another to make sure that you have all the permissions from everybody involved, that they're okay with it going to press. So, and finally, when it came down to the writings especially the writings of the preface and the other writings that I contributed afterward, and to make sure that the transmission of the original texts was trouble-free, Yvonne was an amazing resource in making sure that everything that went down onto paper was unchallengeable. That was the thing, and nothing could be brought forward that would suggest that there was any slippage. Of course, finally, I really have to acknowledge Dan Adler, who wrote a terrific introduction, as Paulette mentioned, and indebted to Dan for the hard work that he put in and I think the incredible acuity of his perception in addressing what this book might actually have as value. So I think with those remarks, I hope you understand that a venture such as this is a complicated one that involves many people working hard hours and I have to acknowledge therefore also the people who ultimately gave me the permissions, because they too had to get to work and make sure that what they were telling me was going to be correct. So, it's a lot of people working very hard over a very long period of time to actually produce this, let alone, finally, the look of the book itself. The cover, they asked for input, which is why the cover includes what appears to be a blackboard, which I actually had to do and send to them so they could use it on the cover. But the cover was designed in-house by Concordia, and I want to say how pleased I am by what they did. it's not always the case that a publisher comes up with a good cover, but I was very happy with this one. So I'm here really just to open up the book, as it were, to give you a sense of it by reading from, in the case we have here this afternoon, 4 texts that I thought might be enjoyable, perhaps, for you to hear before you have the chance to read the book at some other time. So I'm just going to read from 4 texts that I selected from the publication, and I hope that they'll give you a sense of the kind of range, perhaps, of what's in it. So I think for that, I'm just going to start, and I want to, there's a couple of illustrations here that I'm going to have available because I'm reading a text, but of course behind the text there is a work. And because you may not have access to the book at the moment, I'm going to make sure that you see what it is I was seeing at the time. So I think we're pretty well there now. And in the same sense that Philip Monk once gave a great lecture at the Rivoli in Toronto back in the 70s. Philip, if any of you know Philip, he's very precise, Philip Monk. And I still remember Philip walking to the podium with a red rose in his lapel and sitting down, and before he started he said, "This lecture will take exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I won't take any questions until after that." So we all knew that it was going to take 1 hour and 15 minutes, and we could hold off on any questions we might have. But anyway, in that same spirit, I'm going to read these texts, and hopefully you'll enjoy them. And if you have questions at the end, of course, I'd love to hear from you. All right, so the texts are from, the first one I'm going to read is from 1989, and the second from 1997, the third from 2010, and the final is from my afterword in the book, which is 2023, I think. All right, so the first text is very short. It's the introduction to remarks that I gave at a symposium in 1989 called Made in Canada, Situating the Canadian Art Identity. And Yvonne was reminding me that back in the day, and perhaps even more alive perhaps now, Canadian identity was fraught. It was a question for everybody. You couldn't really go to a lecture without somebody talking about the Canadian identity. So here we are in 2025, casting our minds back to 1989, when the Canadian identity didn't have to face being the 51st state, but at least it was alive and well as a problem. And so this is the small introduction I gave to that symposium. The rest of my remarks went on for about 25 pages, I think, so we'll just restrict ourselves to this. This is the brief to the symposium then. I wrote, "It is important to examine first just what are the main assumptions currently operative in Canadian culture, and consequently in Canadian art and criticism, and then to consider what direction implied by these assumptions would best serve our interests. We are North American. Despite serious misassumptions we hold, we are not like America or even Western Europe. We are not economically and politically powerful, nor have we, like the major powers, mythologized our identities into totalizing presumptions. This allows us a predisposition to appreciate historical context, individual construction, and political intervention as more than novelties on the one hand or national emergencies on the other. Our curiosity about our own identity is a manifestation of this general condition. The direction this should take us in, I believe, is towards a strengthening of our terms of inquiry, both within our national cultures and outside of them. Ultimately, Canada's identity and the identity significant to Canadian art and criticism should involve a sophisticated recognition of how identity works and what responsibilities it entails. And so from there, I went on to all the questions the symposium was asking us to deal with. My second selection from 1997 is from a review that I wrote on the Montreal artist Angela Grauerholz and her exhibition at the time, Fellow Traveler, that was at the Olga Koper Gallery in the fall of '97. Now, Angela had prefaced her exhibition with a quote, her own quote, her footnote, you might say, on the exhibition, and she wrote, "They are the images that we have from our memory of what the future used to look like." I'm standing looking at a cluster of travelers boarding an airplane. The plane is not large, and there cannot be more than a dozen figures assembled on the wet tarmac. And I'm just going to show you the image of this is from Canadian Art, the image of the work in question. It's been raining, though it has stopped now, and despite the brightness in the sky's horizon, everything near is dark, smudged in the gloom of a rain-soaked pause. Within this ambiguity, a white line painted luminously on the surface of the runway intersects with me at the center of my vision. My viewpoint seems picked out, as in a perspective study, and the scene before me, despite its indeterminacy, becomes an exercise in the appropriateness of things in the world. I'm standing in the Olga Koper Gallery, looking at Travelers by Angela Grauerholz, and the indeterminate nature of the photograph is oddly replicated here. The sun at the moment is from the west, and its light passes through the clear story onto the gallery walls and floor in ever-shifting intensities. A thin ray just touches one edge of the austere black frame, which gives this, and the other 9 works in Grauerholz's exhibition, a sense of mourning reminiscent of the black borders on commemorative stamps in my boyhood collection. I experience a sense of epiphany as I watch the sunlight's measurement of time deepen and intensify the image's own suspension of time. I think about Angela Grauerholz's remark about memory and future. There is a point of view central to all these works, and Travelers is emblematic in this respect. Each occupies language in a double register. Let's call the first a declension, because it's about naming or placing. As I occupy that view of the runway in the picture, it occurs to me I am privileged in several ways, by my apartness from the travelers, by the darkness which envelops me, by the centrality mapped by the white line, by the black frame itself. There is a reiteration of separation. I had been declined. In precisely which grammatical case, however, remains obscure, and within that obscurity I am displaced, named a flaneur, a nomad, ironically, a fellow traveler. Let's call the second register conjugation, because it's about acting or timing. I have to think, what is it I'm doing on that runway? How is it that I'm there? And what does it signify that I'm also here in the gallery, watching the sunlight activate a photograph, watching it move gradually towards night? What tense do I occupy? Past, present, future? Sometimes we need to listen to artists. When Angela Grauerholz speaks about her images as what the future used to look like, I realize I can be in several tenses at once. I can be in the future anterior. And now I know my tense. I'm back in the future. So that's from 1997. Now, I've chosen this one because it's about a problem in art that I find fascinating, which is why I've written this essay, I suppose. But it's also a text for a projected catalog, which unfortunately didn't occur, but it was in fact used in the exhibition. It was an exhibition called Yvonne Lemerick and Joan Key, incidentally, at the Nunnery Gallery in London, England, in April-May 2010. The work concentrate on the title of the exhibition, incidentally. I shifted the notion of incidental to include parenthesis. And in the review, or catalog essay, excuse me, I selected a particular quote from Bertrand Russell that I discovered in Wikipedia when I looked up parenthesis, just as I wanted to check my facts and just see what Wikipedia had to say about it. When I came across this little snippet of a quote from Russell, I thought it was quite perfect. But I should point out that the quote goes like this: "Mathematics, comma, rightly viewed, comma, possesses not only truth but supreme beauty." Now, what's interesting about the quote is that it inserts a command when rightly viewed, and that parenthetical remark breaks up the sense of the sentence and causes one to question. So it's that questioning that the parenthesis can produce, the sense of incidental, that I wanted to concentrate on in the text. So the text. "The pleasure of the parenthesis is its invitation to a digression. Perhaps we can even say that pleasure itself constitutes a digression, that it lies only within or dependent upon that obtuse level of self-interrogative meaning that Roland Barthes suggests is the realm of art, but which might also be the evocative realm of plenitude, amplitude, beatitude, solitude, similitude, for states, in other words, that suggest something beyond the reach of closure. At any rate, the parenthesis qualifies, interpolates, intervenes in the structure of linear meaning. It enlarges our relationship to something by interrupting our concentration from within. It destabilizes one truth by the simultaneous delivery of another. It is this simultaneity of the incidental, this interpolation, that operates centrally in Lemerick's work, and which is specifically located in the title of this exhibition at the Nunnery. This is, I'm not sure if you can see it properly, but this is the work that I was talking about. For Lemerick, these struggles with the image, as Canadian critic Philip Monk has put it, are part of the game. It is a game written into the grammar and syntax of language, in fact, into the dialectical relations existing between the mind that reflects and the body that engages. Sight, sight, line, the title of the work. For instance, a tall square column with mirrors at eye level on each side occupies the center point of a square gallery. Intermittently painted black lines, precisely spaced around the gallery's perimeter walls, connect as a single line in the four mirrors when perceived from set positions in the space. In effect, the painted lines and their reflected images combine to fold the envelope of the space into a coherence constructed for the viewer from the collapse of physical and virtual experience, creating a moment of uneasy simultaneity. Within that moment, we are, incidentally, neither the one nor the other. Finally, I just want to read a short piece. It's the postscript from the anthology. I wrote a long preface for it as well. I was asked to. But when I had, more or less when I was coming to the end of the selections and seeing what now lay within the bounds of this publication, I thought a little bit of a postscript, a bit of a thought about what I had just experienced. And you have to remember, for the first time, these writings between 75 and 2020, I hadn't read most of them for decades. So the publication, the book, represented very much a revisitation into worlds that I had long since moved beyond. So having gone through the process of reading through these and struggling with them, it occurred to me that I needed to really reflect on what I had experienced, and this was my reflection. And it's from 2023, January 2023, 2 years ago. I find that in the act of writing, there is a moment when the writing itself erases its subject, the work of art, though clearly that work remains as a trace. To use Heidegger's invention, it remains under erasure, quote unquote, present and necessary, but for that moment set aside or overwritten. In its place are the words, and it is now the authority of the words that determines the work. I write this with some trepidation, since undeniably it is the work of art that enables the writing. But there is no contradiction, or rather, there would only be a contradiction if both the work and the word were simultaneously to occupy the same space. It is the very absence of the one in the space of the other that enables their dialectical relationship to engage the viewer in a space that neither the work nor the words can themselves occupy. Hovering over the pages of the text, and Magritte-like over the work itself, is the inchoate shape of possibility that remains greater than either. What then is this text that rests on the page? What relationship does it hold for the absent work, this work that is now under erasure? It is not the work, it is not even a semblance of the work. It has become a working out in itself, an unconcealing, to use another Heideggerian term, that is not so much about the truth of its subject, but about the text as an opening up of what could be of value in the possibilities that the work is either intentionally or inadvertently called into existence. So that was my reflections on what it is to write about art. I guess finally I'll just say that hovering, Magritte-like, over this whole enterprise, and acknowledged, of course, by the press, is the fact that, like Liz, like Ken, I'm an artist. And I generally think of myself primarily through that lens. But there is no contradiction, as I suggested. There is a sense of simultaneity, that one can occupy two spaces at the same time, spaces that are quite different from one another, but nonetheless arc between them to produce something that neither the original work nor, of course, the writing itself can possibly be, only what it can offer to you as you read and think about the work that you presumably have seen or had contact with. So, as an artist, of course, I've certainly enjoyed looking back through these writings, which I wrote as an artist. I was writing very much in the vein of reflecting on the work of my peers, primarily, reflecting on the requests from the various publications that asked me to write in the first place, and just enjoying, I guess, the moment of being both an artist and a writer in that sense of semi-contradiction. Anyway, that was generally the whole process that the book represents. I do think that along with Liz and Ken, it surely must offer, as Paulette and Rob were suggesting, offers something to move forward to bring forward as we move forward into whatever further contradictions we're going to be experiencing in the next few years. So, I'll also say that, coming to something that Rob said, that things were a bit different then, and I spent 25 years living in an illegal manufacturing building from the 19th century in downtown Toronto. And one of the joys of the contradiction of living in a space that was illegal was that the caretaker and I had an understanding that he left at night. I was there during the night as the night watchman. And nothing could possibly go wrong until the inspector showed up, of course. Anyway, they were amazing times. So, and I kind of, I don't know, of course I'm anticipating, but I think it's very different now, of course, for young artists, especially in a place like Toronto, Montreal even, for the major cities, for artists to find a perch. Because increasingly those perches are being subsumed by the rapid population of these cities and the need for space for housing. So the times are changing, and I'm quite sure that younger artists are finding means of dealing with it. But when we look back, as Rob was, to how we were able to work in a major city like Toronto, it's certainly compelling to realize how privileged we were. Anyway, I think if anybody has any questions, I'm quite happy to entertain them. And I'm sure Rob and Paulette feel the same way. So, all right. I'm going to sit down. You can just ask questions. And thank you very much for your patience.
Are there questions?
I just want to clarify something you mentioned about your last semester. So you were saying that you view yourself as an artist, also as an essayist, and we know from your work you're also an installationist, and often your installations often use words. So it seems that your editorial ground of our word or linguistics is very much a proponent of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view yourself, aside from the word artist? Do you see yourself as a thinker, as an essayist, as a carpenter? We know you're all those things, but what do you see yourself as? You can answer that question.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, that gets back to something that I think Paulette alluded to, the notion of the verb. And thinking of your list, actually, Rory, how about all of those things? Because they're all about activity. They're about making things. They're about doing. And in fact, teaching, as we were talking about here, teaching is a form of doing. You don't just go in there and be a teacher. You go in there to act with others around the problem of what teaching can be and what learning, which is the flip side of teaching, really involves. The fact of the matter is that, of course, having said that, that people often ask you, well, what do you do? You know, what are you? How are you? And you're usually called upon to say, well, I'm an artist, or something like that. So I tend to avoid that answer because it's always a question what an artist is. But I do know what an artist does, and it does a number of different things, from carpentry through to writing text, I suppose. An amusing aside on that might be that I studied history at Queen's, modern history, and I studied library science, as it was then called. It's now called, what is it called now? Information science, or information something or other. And for 18 years, after 3 years working at the University of Toronto Library, I ran the library at OCAD, at OCA. So probably for the first couple of decades of my career, when asked upon to say what I do, I usually said I'm a librarian because I enjoyed being a librarian. It was perhaps if you're going to use a noun, that was the one that came to me as the most useful. After all, you're actually contributing something to people that they can understand. And it's an incredibly enjoyable experience. So, but yes, so I think the cue here is the verb to do. What do I do? And thanks for the question.
I think something that not many people realize is that when we grew up in the 70s and the Canada Council was formed, 60s or something like that, in order to apply for the grant, you had to write. You had to explain your work, you had to do some research in historical. And that's quite different from European artists at the time whom I knew, who were not being asked to have to explain and write about their work. So all of us became pretty good at writing about our work and therefore writing about each other's work. And artist centers were formed because we weren't just making shows, we were also writing about the shows, promoting, exhibitions, curating. I mean, artists, we were like a DIY. We did it ourselves from that period.
Yeah.
So if there's anybody else who knows that generation, you know what I'm talking about. And I think we all learned to write in one way or another.
Yeah, I am. I'm glad you mentioned that because I remember at one point I had a theory going, which was that when Europeans always chided us for being too intellectual, I thought, well, it's got to be the fault of the Canada Council who made us write about our work. So I think the Canada Council has a lot to answer for.
Anyone else?
Oh, yeah.
So it was fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm interested in the similarities between writing and painting or any other kind of art or brand. And I was talking about this earlier. My background has all been film, television, making, design. I see that as a collaborative art. Two things that are different about it is you asked for often millions of dollars to get your artwork. So it's almost like the old days of having a patron. Nothing happens at all. So you convince somebody that you can make one evening. And then you often have, I've done child seekers with 25 people. You have to convince all of that, that your idea will flow and all that kind of stuff. So I'm interested in both of your views as to how do you think a collaborative artist thinks about their art in a fundamentally different way from an individualist artist? Writing and painting to me, even now was for fun, and we both said it's the only non-mediated artistic event I never participated in. Either writing and or painting ever. Right? And so if you have those two, how do you both? Your minds must be so different. In the way you approach things when you have to take a troop of 30 people along with you.
I'm going to let Paulette answer primarily to that, but I will say that the reason why the Canada Council forced us to write was that they realized, and we certainly realized, that the only kind of audience you're going to get is one that can interpret and understand the work for themselves. And it's not always that easy for people to come to an artwork and find a fusion between themselves and that work sufficient that would give the work its agency. So although we're not appealing for funds from companies or governments, except through the Canada Council, of course, we are nonetheless trying to appeal to a public, to individuals, not just a public, but individuals, as to what they could possibly construct between themselves and the work. So I would say that. But Paulette actually has a real experience in what you're talking about. So Paulette.
Well, I think that a concept drives the project, and so when you're working on something like a film or theater or larger event, you bring in experts who have expertise doing a particular thing, and we all unify ourselves under the concept. And I guess it's my role to make sure the concept is communicated clearly. And then actually, it's collaborative in as much as I usually hope that the experts bring more to my project than I can bring. And there is the magic and the beauty is that you've got people, and there's something beautiful about, you have an idea, but then, the camera person, they have, you go, well, I see it going this way, and then they're like, well, what about? And then you go, well, yeah, what about? And so that part of it, the decision-making part of it, becomes a teamwork. And you have expertise on board, so that's beautiful. Like, I don't know how to do titles, or at least somebody's going to bring something more. But but one has, and maybe Ian and I share this, the concept of what we're trying to do. And I know, having tried to raise millions of dollars in the film world, that my ideas don't fly in that world. I'm just struck by how bland I'm looking at things on streaming networks, or streaming platforms, and just like the kind of, what a boring landscape we're living in right now. And when you see an artistic film, like for instance, I went to see Queer the other day. Michael and I went to see Queer, and that was a real that was a vision, a very unusual vision in that film that you would have difficulty funding, let's put it that way, in the Canadian landscape. But it also had multiple, money is what drives us away from the film industry, because it's just so difficult to raise funds, and it's so expensive.
But I was thinking more of when I was active in film, I'm talking the 80s in the UK. And sort of talking Derek Jarman and Peter Greenaway, they're not making anything like commercial films. But
right.
To your point, you can't think about your art in the same way a painter does, because there's a concept, there's an umbrella, there's a world that you're trying to conceive that it is going to be more than one thing, right? That's when I paint, it's like, here in my hand, here's this brush, there's that paint. I'm not explaining anything to anybody, not even understanding myself yet, where you would never approach a Peter Greenaway short film that way. Not a chance, right?
Well, first you started,
an idea where you're going.
You started in art school.
Yeah, they all did, and they continue to stay there, right?
Yeah, and television funded that work too. And national television, a non-commercial television funded that work. Non-commercial, because it's not really viable. Ian had a question.
Yeah, was there a question? Yes.
I had a question from the emergent arts perspective. It looks like this period in the 70s and 80s was also wonderful, and you could also talk with each other and also about each other. So let's say, what would you imagine we could build in community life here in Prince Edward County, very hyper-local, because we have a lot of artists. And that would make it safe for us to come and write and make and do this inter-thinking of that writing creates and then about other people. And I would love to hear wisdom.
Oh, I'm sure there are many answers to that, and I'm hoping to hear Rob and Paulette talk about that. But I will say that, and this is going to allow me to make some remarks that I wanted to be sure to make before we ended the evening. I want to thank Deborah Root very much for her introduction to the afternoon. Really cogent, beautifully written, and no surprise. And very, very thankful for that. And of course to Carlin and Barbara for having the gallery. And if you come back to a space, a location, a place from which something can happen, well, I quoted earlier Philip Monk talking at the Rivoli Tavern in Toronto back in the 1970s, very much like this. The Rivoli had a little podium, and Philip could sort of walk up onto it and dominate the audience. But here we are in a very, very much the same kind of space, a space in which people can contribute and channel ideas and construct that sense of a community, let's call it a community, interest, a community of interest in which ideas can be traded back and forth and can be taken onto another location, quite like this. Or a place like the Rivoli, which was in the business of being a place where people made their statements, and people came, amazingly, just like this. So it's not that hard, but of course the mechanisms have to be there. And I want again to thank Carlin for offering the mechanism, and for Deborah to bring it together. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Carlin.
Ian, just to follow up on the question, yeah, there are physical spaces that you can organize ceremoниes in. There's also Zoom, I mean, there are lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, Zoom.
obviously enough people, enough artists of all kinds in the county that it's all to happen.
Yeah, there are modern technologies, of course, that weren't available in 1973. Certainly Zoom, for instance, is an interesting, I wouldn't want to depend solely on Zoom, because I think it's the physical presence of people coming together that is so important, but Zoom can be an excellent peripheral construction by which to keep that thing going. Mm-hmm. Okay, if that's it.
Yeah, I guess
Sure.
we could move on to the more informal part. And you'll be signing books?
Oh yes, yes, I'm here. I haven't got a pen, but somebody has, I'm sure.